Mate to Thrive Nation, we're going to be talking about environmental toxins, environmental medicine. It's going to be an incredible show. And I've got Dr. Kelly McCann on the show. She's a medical doctor. She's done a master's in public health, a real expert in environmental and tropical medicine. So just a warm welcome to you, Dr. Kelly.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve. I really appreciate it.
Brilliant. And I just want to talk about toxicity. I just find with more and more clients and more patients, a lot of them are doing the right things and, they're fasting, insulin's good, and they're watching their glucose and they're using CGM, but they can't lose weight, or they've got a lot of symptoms, insomnia, fatigue, especially mental fatigue. So I think toxicity is a part of medicine that I don't think has been addressed like it should. Just give us the state of toxicity in the world and how it's affecting people's health.
Yes, thank you. It's a tremendous problem. It's really the underlying tsunami of chronic illness, I think, and it's largely unrecognized by certainly conventional medicine, but even functional medicine just pays like lip service to really what's going on. And environmental medicine doctors have been around since the 60s. And most of the time they were treating people who had multiple chemical sensitivity, right? These were people who had been poisoned by some sort of toxic exposure, oftentimes pesticides or different volatile organic compounds. And then they couldn't tolerate being in life. And it's really interesting because I do think, and there's been studies to link these things together, that multiple chemical sensitivity is a form of mast cell activation syndrome, which is also a burgeoning new diagnosis that is overwhelming many functional medicine doctors because it is becoming more and more common. And, I think the thing that is really most important to understand is it's all about the total load, right? So in environmental medicine, we talk about the total load. I like the image of the sink. The body is a sink, right? Because some people's sinks are huge and they've got really big drains. That's their ability to detox. And these are people that can party like rock stars and die in their sleep, even though they drank and smoked all their lives and they die in their 90s, right? Then there are the canaries in the coal mine who have really shallow sinks and narrow drains, and they just can't tolerate anything or not too much, right? And then the idea is the water in the sink is all the environmental toxins, and this can include mold and chronic infections. And the more exposures we have to these environmental toxins, which I'll go into, the more our sink gets filled up, the more it clogs the drain. And so we get stuck in this loop where we're exposed to so many things. We can't detox very well because our drains are clogged. And then the overflow is all of the symptoms that show up. The allergies, autoimmune conditions, multitude of symptoms, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel symptoms, dysautonomias, POTS, mast cell activation, etc. So really at the core of it, and I think what we need to pay attention to more in functional medicine is this environmental toxicant piece. So that would be my thought.
Yeah, that's a great overview. And you might have heard the words MCAS, mast cell activation syndrome. You don't know what that is. And I think I'll get Dr. Kelly just to explain that, or multiple sensitivities or sensitive patients that are out there and you're just not responding like the average person. I don't like to use the word normal, but you just can't seem to get a grip of all these signs and symptoms that are really plaguing your life. Maybe just define what those two terms are.
So mast cell activation syndrome is talking about a specific kind of cell in our immune system, the mast cell, and everyone has one. These cells, right? They're born in the bone marrow. They move to the areas of the periphery in our body, so they line our upper respiratory tract, GI tract, genitourinary system. They surround our nerves and our blood vessels, and their job is to seek out and sound the alarm when they see a foreign invader. Environmental toxins are foreign invaders, mold, different kinds of infections, COVID. So the mast cells, their job and everyone is to sound the alarm. But what happens in people who have a hypersensitivity reaction where they start misperceiving the foods that they eat, the flowers that they're smelling, different things that we're supposed to be able to tolerate. For some reason, their mast cells have become trigger happy, right? And so they have the mast cells themselves are filled with these chemical messengers, we call them mediators, that are a combination of inflammatory agents, cytokines, chemokines, enzymes, and they get released when the mast cells are sounding the alarm. Pre-COVID, the rates of mast cell activation was about 17% in the population. Okay. I think it's much higher these days. I think it's more like 25%. And honestly, well, I mean, I have a specialized practice, but in complex chronic illness and sometimes functional medicine practices, the mast cell activation patients are becoming more and more numerous. My practice is probably 75%, 80% mast cell patients. Wow. Because they have these exposures. And really I think what's underlying it is a dysregulated nervous system. There's oftentimes a lot of trauma history that goes along with this syndrome. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the multiple chemical sensitivity. So patients with multiple chemical sensitivity can really pinpoint, okay, when I smell gasoline, when I walk down the detergent aisle in the grocery store, when I go to the mall, I'm overwhelmed by the scents and I get all of these inflammatory symptoms, right? So the definition of mast cell activation is a combination of multiple symptoms in multiple systems of the body that are inflammatory, allergic, and growth-oriented. And that's really the clinical definition that we use in what I would call consensus 2, as opposed to many allergists whose definition is you have to have a tryptase level, which is a blood level, of some percentage higher when you're in a flare. What?
All right.
Not really helpful.
Yeah. And I think that's important that you and yourself, and we'll link to Dr. Tanya Dempsey's episode and Dr. Neil Nathan's show. But someone's listening out there, what do? Do they do a test with a functional medicine doc? They've heard this now and they're like, oh, this could be me. I've tried. Where do they go? Or what do they do?
Yeah, definitely want to find a functional medicine practitioner who is savvy in mast cell activation. And that does require a little bit more work to identify those folks. Naturopathic doctors sometimes can also specialize in mast cell activation. And, as a patient trying to help themselves, identifying your triggers as much as you can, and avoiding them, and even starting some simple things like, depending upon your level of sensitivity, you can play around with histamine blockers, antihistamines, things like Zyrtec, Claritin, Xyzal. These are the names of them in the United States. Allegra, Pepcid, H2 blockers. And then there are so many herbs and different kinds of nutraceuticals that can help, things like quercetin, luteolin. Some people have more issues with breaking down histamine, and then there are enzymes that help break down histamine, like DAO enzymes that you would take with meals. There are pharmaceuticals, of course, so you're working with a physician who can practice and prescribe. Cromolyn sodium can be very helpful as an oral medication. Ketotifen can be helpful as well. Leukotriene inhibitors, oftentimes used for allergies and asthma, can sometimes be helpful. The trick is that everyone's mast cells are different in terms of their combination of mediators that they have, and every tissue of the body in a single person has a different combination of mast cell mediators. So The combinations of potential treatment options for people is very vast. There's no one size fits all ever, because of that fact.
Mm.
So it's oftentimes about trial and error. I actually do muscle testing with my patients to try and limit that trial and error. That's,
Mm.
not from my conventional training at
Yeah,
all.
sure.
And many of my colleagues don't agree with that. But when people are suffering for a long period of time, I want to optimize things as quickly as possible for them.
Brilliant. Well, well done to you to combine the different sort of medicines and take the best out of it. I think that's crucially important. But let's look at, environmental toxins. I've heard that 80,000, toxins have been introduced in the last 80 years. What are the big things that people should be just aware of to, I think the average woman puts 196 chemicals on her face by 9 o'clock in the morning. So just name some things. I think avoidance is difficult, and then we'll get into the specifics of, and I don't really like the word detox, but it's because it's overused, but I think the ways that people can get rid of these toxins.
Yeah, so the list is pretty long. It's kind of an alphabet list. Some of the easiest ways to think about it are some of these chemicals are persistent, and then some are not persistent when we avoid them. So, of the ones that are persistent, we can talk about toxic metals. I don't use the term heavy metals anymore because some of the toxic metals are not heavy. But the big players are lead, mercury, cadmium, arsenic. And then I can go into those in more detail, but those are the ones that we focus on the most. Of course, there are other metals that are up and coming and equally causing problems. In terms of other persistent ones, flame retardants are some of the biggest problems. And those are very difficult to avoid. In California, we put flame retardants in our mattresses. You cannot purchase a mattress without flame retardant in it unless you have a doctor's note, and then you're having a custom mattress made, which can get very expensive. And then there are things like PCBs and the older pesticides like DDT. Those have been banned for use in the United States, at least since the 70s, but they're still in the environment. And they tend to accumulate in animal products, fatty animal products, things like butter actually has some of the highest sources of PCBs and those older pesticides like DDT. And we can't really test for them anymore. At one point, we could test for the presence of these things. I think Genova Diagnostics had an environmental toxicant panel that had that in there. We used to be able to do fat biopsies to identify these things. But we don't have any way to test for these at this point in time. And then things like glyphosate. Would be more persistent. I'm sure there are other ones, but I'll move on. Now, on the non-persistent side, most of the pesticides that are used today are not persistent. So if you eat organic and you go from eating a conventional diet to an organic diet, within days, you are no longer being exposed to organophosphate pesticides. Hooray, that's great, right? So eating organic is something that people understand, and we can limit our pesticide exposures. In terms of some of the other things you mentioned, makeup and personal care products, those chemicals are parabens and phthalates, PHTH phthalates. And those are your plastics. They also tend to be fragrances. So phthalates are fragrances. And in a lot of the personal care products, the manufacturers are not required to put adequate labels on them. So if something says fragrance, you know it's not going to be great. Fortunately, there are a lot of resources these days for being able to identify which personal care products are better than others. EWG, the Environmental Working Group, has a skin deep database, which is reasonable. There's a couple of apps on the phones that people can use where you can scan the barcode of a product. And then there are a lot more products out there available that may not be in the large databases that are, mom and pop type manufacturing companies that are still up and coming, and they might be able to, they might be very clean products. And then let's talk about plastics. So plastics, we all know what plastic is. Unfortunately, when plastic breaks down into smaller particles, you get microplastics and nanoplastics. Those microplastics and nanoplastics can go all throughout the body. And there really aren't good ways at this moment in time to detox plastic. And then plastics are often also combined with other chemicals. So things that make plastic hard also will have the bisphenols, the BPA, BPS, BPF, which are, although not persistent, very ubiquitous, right? We're exposed to these all the time. They're in the lining of cans, they're on receipt paper, they're kind of everywhere. And then the phthalates, the softer plastics, they're in our water bottles. I mean, they're in our personal care products, as I mentioned. So, but you could even get flame retardants in the plastics. You can get heavy metals in the plastics. And so plastics are a huge, huge problem, and avoidance really is key. Drink out of glass and steel. Don't heat your food in plastic. I mean, really, we should be focusing very aggressively at avoiding plastic as much as possible, not just for our own health, but for the health of the planet.
Yeah. And I think that's crucially important that, you summarized it exceptionally well, but just plastics, the heating of plastics, we advocate sauna like you cannot believe with Matey Thrive, and yet people take a plastic bottle into a sauna, and they don't realize that the plastic is heating up, and you're talking about 90 degrees centigrade, which is, I don't know what it is in Fahrenheit, but it's really, really hot in a Finnish sauna, or they in an infrared sauna taking plastic in it. And that's very detrimental, I think, to their health. But I think that, and this is simply put, it's not going to detox. And once again, the word detox, get rid of these things. But I think sauna is probably, if not one of the easiest, and sometimes not the most effective, but the easiest ways. And, people and executives and business leaders at the practice here, and we do a lot of corporate work, you sometimes got to give them the easiest way because that's the best way. It might not be the most effective way, but it's the best way because they do it. Tell us about your view on sauna in terms of being just a staple. My view is you should be in there, on average, we say 5 to 6 times, even if you just get a sweat after like 7, 8 minutes, as long as you get that sweat, I think is crucially important. Your view?
Yes, I completely agree, Steve. Sauna is really easy. It's accessible to a lot of people. It doesn't feel invasive. And yeah, sweating is key. Stephen Genuis out of Canada did a ton of research on the toxin excretion that would happen with sauna. And fortunately, almost everything can come out with sauna, with a few exceptions. Unfortunately, flame retardants do not come out with sauna. But we can get heavy metals out, toxic metals, we can get mold out, we can get a lot of the non-persistent environmental toxicants out. Plastics, probably not so much. Sure. But at least the phthalates and the parabens that are often accompanying the plastics can be excreted through sweat. And yeah, I don't really have a preference. There's always this debate between far infrared and near infrared and which one's most important. Like, get in the sauna, get a sweat on as much as you can. And I think that you'll improve your detox capacity simply by sauna. Other less appealing ones would be things like coffee enemas or colonics. Huge, important way to get out environmental chemicals, particularly the persistent ones, because they're fat soluble, meaning they are fat loving and they're going to end up in the gallbladder if you have a gallbladder, and they're going to be dumped into the gastrointestinal tract when you eat something fatty or when you do a coffee enema or a colonic. So the bile contains a lot of these fat soluble toxins, the PCBs, the pesticides, some of the flame retardants. Then when you have a coffee enema or a colonic, the stimulation of the colon induces the gallbladder to dump the bile, which is where all your toxins are. And then our very efficient colons often will grab that bile, pull it back into the system because bile is expensive to make, and so we need to overcome that enterohepatic recirculation that's pulling the bile back in by doing the coffee enemas and the colonics, because then you're getting much larger bile dumps. And then not only that, you can follow that with some binders like activated charcoal, bentonite clay, stuff like that to help bind up some of those extra toxins that have been released in the bile dumps. But that is the fastest way to get rid of some of these more persistent, harder to detox environmental chemicals.
Cool. Let me just, we're going to drill down a bit into the sauna because I think it's important. I learned from you glycerine soap afterwards. Why is it important to use glycerine as in terms of your soap after the sauna?
Thanks for that. I actually learned that from my mentor, Dr. Walter Crinian, who is a naturopathic doctor, died a number of years ago, sadly. But he was really the one who taught that it's supposed to be able to better bind some of these chemicals that are sitting on your skin.
Cool. And then afterwards in binding, what's your best for sauna? And you said, I think your protocol is half an hour afterwards. I wanted to sort of get your understanding why you take a binder half an hour afterwards, which is your most used one, and what has sort of moved the numbers and moved the symptoms. We talk a lot about chlorella and just the real importance of chlorella. Things like obviously the activated charcoal and the bentonite clay. What's your sort of strategy there?
Yeah, I will say I am not really a scientist. So oftentimes it's giving the protocols and leaving it up to the patients in some part to decide what they're going to take, what they're willing to take and able to take. As my practice has evolved more, my patients are so sensitive. Chlorella in a mast cell patient rarely does well. I should say, patients with mast cell activation rarely do well with chlorella, unfortunately, because it does have much more binding capacity with some of these environmental chemicals. Many of the mast cell patients have mold exposure, and chlorella can be helpful for mold exposure, but as I said, they don't do as well. And for convenience, a combo product would be nice for people that has both activated charcoal and bentonite clay. That being said, many of my mast cell patients are on like sprinkles of things, and so we're really not doing a lot of aggressive detox with them. There's a combo product I like called GI Detox that if patients are able to tolerate it, it does have that clay and charcoal mix and a few other things that help also reduce the likelihood of constipation, which can happen with sauna. With detox. So I'd really have to go back and look at the literature from Genoist to identify, is a half an hour perfect timing, or can we do it a little bit later? It may also depend on just on the time of day that things are done, when people are eating, their motility of their gastrointestinal system, things like that.
Brilliant. And then in terms of using ozone and rectal insufflation, do you think that's better than using the colonics, the traditional water colonics, and the coffee enemas? There's been some type of issues with some patients with colonics using, that type of irrigation with the water. Do you think, what is your view there and what experience have you got?
I don't have a lot of experience. I will say, though, that when I did some ozone training, my sense was that the rectal insufflation with ozone was more about upregulating the internal antioxidant enzyme systems and less about bile dumps, right? Because I don't really think that you're getting that stimulation to dump bile with the rectal insufflation. So, if part of the challenge with detoxification is inflammation, oxidative stress, then it may be that the rectal ozone could be beneficial. It's certainly less invasive than doing ozone IV and less expensive. People can do it at home. So a lot of my patients, the patients who are willing to do it, do get a lot of benefit from it, and they do
Mm,
feel like they have more energy, and certainly they have better ability to manage the oxidative
mm,
stress that they're experiencing from all these environmental chemicals, from the mold, from these chronic infections. Because that's what happens is that, when we get exposed to environmental toxins, mold, chronic infections, the body's response is oxidation, right? And so what happens is that we we use up our antioxidants that we have in our diet or our supplementation to try and manage the collateral damage that's being driven by the presence of these things, because we know that environmental toxins, mold, chronic infections cause oxidative stress in the body. And kind of we're only as good as our internal antioxidant enzyme systems, right? There are research studies that show that people who live to be 100, the centenarians, have the most robust internal antioxidant enzyme systems. Glutathione peroxidase, superoxide dismutase, catalase, right? And when we look at the genetics of some of our more challenging patients, oftentimes their antioxidant enzyme systems are not great. They have a lot of variants, and that means that their enzyme systems aren't as capable.
yeah, well said. And I know I don't want to go too deep into the weeds because I do want to talk about the functional medicine labs that have sort of just changed for me in the last 5 years. But chelation, hydrogen peroxide drips that we've used over time, any type of sort of IV that you've found very beneficial for those that want to get rid of a lot of these toxins.
Oh, thank you for asking this question. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. So, phosphatidylcholine is my favorite IV. It's one of my favorite supplements in general. It doesn't get a lot of press. It is not fancy, but it is one of the most effective ways and the safest ways to get environmental toxicants, mold, out of the body. Phosphatidylcholine is the building block of every cell in the body, right? This is our cell membrane. My fingers are the cell membrane. Imagine that there's a toxin sitting in the cell membrane. You take PC, it literally takes out the toxin and heals the cell membrane.
Wow.
Super cool, right? It's on the outside of the cell membrane, if you remember from cell biology. Oral forms of phosphatidylcholine also often have the other phospholipids in there too, which is important. But the IV form is just the phosphatidylcholine. We call it PC for short. There was a lab out of Germany that sadly closed or has now had to be restructured since the owner of the company passed away a couple years ago. That lab was such a cool lab because it was able to identify what environmental chemicals were sitting on your DNA, which is epigenetics, right?
Mm,
So, and not only that, they could identify if there were toxins sitting on the
wow.
mitochondria. And then what we could do is do IV phosphatidylcholine and repeat the test. and see that those environmental chemicals literally have been washed off
Mm.
the DNA and the mitochondria.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, we got to get more information from you there and find out what the latest there is, because I think that is a absolutely amazing testing. Well done to you.
Yes.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of the detox. Maybe you can just speak into, because people sometimes say, oh, but I sweat when I exercise, the difference between active and passive sweating, and then we're going to go into some of the labs.
So sweating in general is great, right? You're going to get some things out. But I think that with sauna, there's a level of penetration of that heat into the tissues that will mobilize more of the environmental toxins. And
Mm.
that's really the big difference.
Brilliant. So what I've noticed, and maybe you can comment, and sort of things like uric acid increasing, fibrinogen, and just hypercoagulability, factor V ladens, things like pi, what's happening over there, which has just it's been a dramatic shift. And maybe start with fibrinogen. I've never seen levels like this across the board, especially with my corporates. I haven't seen uric acid levels at this level before. Do you have sort of any insights onto traditional functional lab tests that have now you've realized, oh my goodness, this has now been the canary in the coal mine, or this is really indicating something more than we thought it did?
Yes, I've definitely seen a lot of hypercoagulability. So some of the tests that you mentioned, like factor V Leiden, this plasminogen activator inhibitor 1, prothrombin mutations, these are gene mutations. Protein C, protein S, antithrombin 3, those are all genetic. And they're not, well, I should say, the majority are thought not to be that common. I have to tell you, Steve, the
Mm.
plasminogen activator inhibitor 1 gene variants, so common, at least in my patient population. I really have to run a report on my
Mm.
electron medical record, but I would say roughly 80% of my practice
Wow.
or more has a pi1 gene variant, at least one. Now, when we're talking about coagulation, you've got the coagulation side, so making clot and then breaking down clot side, right? Pi1 is on the breaking down of the clot side, which means that they're not actively making clots, but they can't break them down as quickly. And I think what that translates into is cardiovascular disease and cerebrovascular disease later in life. So, for example, I'm homozygous 4G Pi1. Both sides of my family, heart attacks and strokes. That's how everybody died, pretty much,
Sure.
right? And I don't think anybody in my family ever had a blood clot, but it means that the blood can be stickier.
Mm.
And when you put environmental chemicals, mold, infections, these things tend to stimulate this hypercoagulability.
But are you going to pick that up with labs, Dr. Kelly? Are you going to pick it up with
Yeah.
an HSCRP? Are you going to pick it up with a D-dimer or fibrinogen test? What are we going to see that's increased, even if the delta is maybe 20, 30% higher? I just cannot believe what's happening. And I'm not running INR tests at all, but
Yeah, you won't pick it up in an INR. It's not in an INR, so don't bother with that. Um, Probably the best test, and I don't know if you have it in South Africa, Steve, is a prothrombin fragment 1+2 or 1.2. That's the best test. So those are the debris that's left over when you're making clots. So it directly correlates to increased clot production. That would be the best test to look at. Fibrinogen activity, I find also helpful, but sometimes you can have an elevated prothrombin fragment, 1+2, without the elevated fibrinogen activity, and vice versa. Oftentimes they correlate, but not always.
Mm. Why,
D-dimer
why are
can,
the fibrinogen, sorry, increasing to this degree, do you think? And have you seen that in your practice?
um, mine is really all over the map. It's all over the map. And I check almost everybody all the time.
Mm.
I don't necessarily see an elevation in HSCRP, but yeah, I use a lot of Boluc or lumbrokinase. I use a lot of nattokinase,
Yeah.
and I do think that that helps.
Do you think that across the board now, using nattokinase and lumbrokinase?
Not with absolutely everybody,
Yeah.
but with if they have any evidence of elevated fibrinogen or the elevated prothrombin fragment 1+2, or they have long haul COVID
Mm.
or chronic infections. And some of the interesting things with the hypercoagulability is that it reinforces biofilms. So if somebody has a colonization in their sinuses or their bladder or their prostate of bacteria, the bacteria make the biofilm and the human makes the fibrin clots. And so you get this fibrin matrix that is reinforcing those biofilms, making them that much more difficult to eradicate
Mm.
the bacteria that are living under the biofilm. So, huge issue. I don't know. I mean, my sense is that COVID has changed things for everyone,
Yeah,
whether you got
absolutely.
the vaccine or not.
Mm.
I don't think I know more than a handful of people who have never had COVID. It's also interestingly seems to be changing the lipid fractionation. That's actually what I've been seeing, Steve, is
Tell
that
me.
the lipid fractionation is much more trended towards abnormal. So people could have a normal lipid panel, normal LDL, or
Mm.
under 130, not
Mm.
terrible, right? But their
Mm.
LDL particle
Particle
number
numbers. Mm.
is massively high. It's 2,000, right? What I was taught pre-COVID was if your LDL is 130, your LDL particle number should be like 1,300, right? So it just be 10 times
Mm.
higher. But now they're like
Mm.
hundreds of times higher than that, which is not a good thing, and it doesn't
Yeah.
seem to
Mm.
respond to statins or red yeast rice or anything. I haven't really been able to move the needle on those things.
Mm. Have you seen
So that's one of
ApoB
the
also go up? Apolipoprotein B. Have you seen that also increase?
yeah, that's been increasing too. That one tends to correlate more with the LDL.
Mm.
So not always, but yeah, it's a really interesting trend.
Mm.
And then in terms of the uric acid, it's interesting that you're seeing elevations. I'm seeing decreases in the uric acid. And I learned a little tidbit from a colleague of mine named Dan Goodenow, who's a PhD who wrote a book called Breaking Alzheimer's and talked about plasm plasmalogens, not to be confused with plasminogens.
Yeah.
So, plasmalogens are phospholipids that are critically important for three things: myelin creation, release of neurotransmitters in the brain, particularly acetylcholine, and they're antioxidants. They're the body's antioxidants. I mean, we talk about glutathione all the time,
Mm.
right? But plasmalogens will be sacrificed when there's an oxidative stress. So, for example, I'm going on a little brief tangent,
No,
but
go for
it's
it.
really fascinating.
Yeah.
So, I got COVID in September of 22 and couldn't get out of bed. I was really sick, and I was taking everything: ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, all the things, right?
Mm.
And I eventually got rife and got better. But when I did the prodrome scan that Dr. Goodenow created to assess plasmalogen levels, I was in the toilet. And plasmalogens are built from fish oils and phosphatidylcholine, phospholipids, right?
Mm.
And I've been taking phosphatidylcholine for decades now. And I was still in the toilet. They were so low, and my brain fog was terrible. And I was able to build up the plasmalogens by taking precursor supplements, and that helped my brain fog tremendously. Okay, that long story to say, He shared that uric acid levels ideally should be between 5 and 6. When they're low, that's an indication that there's mitochondrial insufficiency. So many of my patients will have a uric acid of 3, 3.5. And when I go and do an organic acid test, their citric acid cycle markers and their Krebs cycle, it's a mess. They're
Sure.
really insufficient. So those, B1, B2, B3, magnesium, are nothing's working in many of these complex chronic illness patients.
Wow, I think I've got to have him on the show. We had Dr. David Perlmutter on the show who wrote the book called Drop Acid. And he said, I think in 1905, before 1905, I think about 80% of the population was like under 4 in terms of uric acid. So it's just
Oh,
interesting
yes.
to see, you know.
Yeah. And who knows? I mean, that's a really interesting comment. One thing that I have seen with elevated uric acid levels is the flame retardants.
Yeah.
So when people
Wow.
use nonstick pans with flame retardant built into those
Mm,
nonstick pans, that can cause an elevation of uric
mm,
acid. So there were a couple of studies that I did see when I was looking at that.
mm. Anything else that you found interesting? Copper, zinc levels, things like vitamin A, vitamin E, red cell magnesiums, folates, things that, people are sort of easy hanging fruit that you've seen change
Yeah.
significantly.
Um, I I haven't really looked, I didn't really look at copper zinc
Mm,
ratios before. What I would say now is that most people are zinc deficient.
okay.
So what I've been doing is a copper zinc ratio,
Okay.
which ideally would be done with serum, not
Mm,
RBCs. And then the ratio should be between zero point 0.8 copper to zinc and 1.1. And I have a young woman who's on G tube feeds, and her zinc copper zinc ratio was 3. Like,
wow.
oh my goodness.
Sure.
And her zinc level was 40.
Wow.
So terribly deficient. No wonder we can't get her off tube feeds because she can't heal her gut at
Yeah.
all. And I think she's taking like 100 milligrams of zinc. So
Wow.
there's some real absorption issues there too.
Mm.
That's a pretty extreme case, of course, but yeah, most people are zinc deficient.
Okay, good. So this is something that we're seeing incorporates the MTHFR. Maybe you can just explain what methylation is, because this is such a common explanation that we try and give our clients and patients. What is methylation, Dr. Kelly?
So methylation is taking a methyl group, which is a carbon and 3 hydrogen. Carbon has 4 attachment points. So you've got hydrogens on 3 of the attachment points, and then the other attachment point is empty, and that can be stuck on something else, a strand of DNA, a protein, fat, doesn't matter. It can be stuck on something else. And so MTHFR is a gene where and methylation is where we stick a methyl group on something. Methylation happens a billion times a second in every single cell of the body, so it's super important. A lot of people talk about MTHFR as a huge issue. It's one of quite a number of methylation genes and a big cycle where there's lots of different things that can impact one's ability to methylate, including MTR, MTRR, CBS, COMT. And so it's not just about the MTHFR gene. The other thing I would say is, again, when I was doing a lot of genetics, vast majority of my patients have MTHFR genes. They're supposed to be maybe 50% of the population, maybe less. I would say, I don't know, 90% plus have MTHFR gene variants, myself included. Not pretty. It's, homozygous, the C677T gene variant, and a bunch of other variants. And I remember, Steve, I was sitting at an Amy Yasko autism conference back in the early 2000s, and the moms were putting up their kids' methylation panels and talking about the children and their symptoms. And my methylation detox genes were far worse across the board.
Mm.
Most of these kids were like yellow, yellow, yellow,
Yeah.
oh, maybe one red, and then most of them were fine. Red being homozygous, yellow being heterozygous
Yeah.
in this, format, right? I had like, 5 or 6 reds and a lot of yellows, and I was thinking, okay, why am I
Mm.
a medical doctor and clearly cognitively intact, and these children have tremendous amount of issues? It is not all about methylation.
Yeah.
It is about toxic load, right?
Yeah.
It's a big, big difference. So we kind of go back to our sink and our bucket, a sink and our drain.
Mm.
If there's too many toxicants in mom, she's going to pass all those on, and the kids are not going to be able to do methylation, let alone anything else,
Mm.
very
Yeah.
well.
Brilliant. Clean air, clean food, and clean water. Maybe speak about clean air. We use filters and we recommend filters by Hypo Air. It's an American company that we bring in that we find is really, really good with some cool research and filtration of water. Spoken about organic. I think most of the tribe knows about food and how important that is. But maybe speak into the water and the air, which I think starts at home. I think that's pretty important.
Yeah, it is important, especially since we're exposed to the most of the environmental toxins in our homes, and that's from our building materials, right? The glues, the foams, the furniture, the the rugs, the particle board, we can just go on. And then we've got external air pollution as well, which is becoming a bigger and bigger problem, particularly in cities, also with wildfires everywhere. So we take a home and we burn it down. Imagine like how many environmental
Mm.
chemicals are being released into the environment. So yeah, it's really not a luxury, it's a necessity to have good quality air filtration in the home on a regular basis. I mean, especially in bedrooms, and then ideally in the areas where you're spending the most time.
Mm.
So we have some through in every room in the clinic, and I have them all at home as well. There are a couple of models. I mean, I think you really have to look at how what the filtration is. So how small a micron particle can the unit filter? So things like Austin Air, IQ Air, those are the ones that I tend to recommend. I love Austin Air. It's a metal filter, so you don't have all the plastic that we're trying to avoid.
Yeah.
So those are the different things that I think about with air filtration. And it doesn't they don't have to be super expensive. Anything is going to be better than nothing. But if you can afford it, it's worth it. And then certainly having a good air filtration system in your HVAC, if you're a homeowner. In terms of water filtration, same thing. You know, most public health water companies, I'm sorry, like the city water companies or the community water companies, they're doing their best to filter out the infections, right? And some of the bigger toxins, but most of those systems weren't built for the level of environmental chemical exposure that we have now in our water. And so we really need to be vigilant with our water filtration at home as well. And remember that if you're not filtering, if you're just drinking filtered water and you're not filtering the house, then you're still going to be exposed to all those chemicals when you shower, when you take a bath, things like that, when you wash your clothes. And that could be problematic. Things like chlorine get aerosolized. So if there's chlorine in the water because of the disinfection, right? Then you're getting disinfection byproducts from the chlorine and the bromine and the different disinfectants, and those we now know are carcinogens as well. So
So,
there's a lot of medical literature about the disinfection byproducts that are in the water. Or if you're swimming in a pool, they're not filtering that water.
mm,
Yeah, so it gets a little mind blowing when we start to think about all of the chemicals and all the exposures we have on a regular basis. And there's only so much avoidance that we can do, as you mentioned.
mm.
And so we do have to do our best and continue to plug along, right? So if people are listening and they're getting overwhelmed, start with some basics. Start with what you can. If you're not yet eating organic, then choose organic. Um, if you're still heating your food up in plastic and drinking out of plastic water bottles, go out and purchase a glass water bottle and buy Pyrex glass to keep your food in and stop microwaving in plastic. If you're still using a nonstick pan, go out and buy, you know, one of the, one of those. I don't know. Ceramic is good, and then cast iron. I love cast iron,
Mm.
and you get your workout when you're lifting it up too.
Yeah, and I think you answered the next question I was going to ask. Is just one step at a time, clean air, get the water filters. My view is sauna is an absolute must to save up and get a decent sauna. We've got one at home. I think that's very important. Taking the binders as well. Is there any use taking your binder after exercise possibly? Because you've had all the sweat and
Why not? I mean, I think the thing with binders is you have to be careful with the timing. You don't want to bind your nutrients, your
yeah,
food. So you just
exactly.
have to be aware of the timing of that. And I know for a lot of my patients who are
Mhm.
taking, 20, 30, 50 things,
Yeah,
it gets a little tricky to get those binders in there.
right.
And also, to circle back to the fibrinogen,
Mhm.
if you're doing fibrinolytics like nattokinase or lumbrokinase, those also have to be taken away from food and supplements and away from your binders. So the timing of these things
Yeah.
is critical.
And that's crucial for natto kinase, you said, and lumbrokinase, away from any
Yes.
supplementation or food.
Yes. I mean, you can take them together.
Mm.
I also, have many of my patients on biofilm busters because of a chronic infection or, oftentimes with mold exposure patients, they're getting colonized with bacteria and fungus in their noses or in their gastrointestinal tract. So they're on biofilm busters as well. And you can take your biofilm busters with your fibrinolytics. That's one
Okay, there we
plus.
go. We will do another episode on biofilm busters, which is, I think, crucially important because seeing chronic infections at another level. What about sort of hydrogen peroxide nebulization? Do you use any hydrogen peroxide?
I haven't. I don't have experience with that, Steve.
Okay.
Sorry.
Brilliant. Okay. A message of hope. People have listened now. They've heard the simple steps, the complicated steps, getting a good health team around you. We always advocate health coaches because people feel overwhelmed. They need someone to journey with. Maybe you can just speak into that space as you just leave people with hope. Never seen patients in despair and discouragement like this ever before because it just seems that more and more people are getting chronic diseases earlier and earlier. But yeah, just speak into that space, Dr. Kelly.
Yeah, it is easy to get overwhelmed. I think that what I would share with patients and what I would share with your listeners, Steve, is that it's really important to recognize that what you're experiencing is real. If you happen to end up in a doctor's office who starts to discount or dismiss what you're experiencing, get up and walk out
Mhm.
because it's not worth your time
Mm.
or your sensitivity to be in a situation where somebody's not going to believe you and help you because that's where you have to really advocate for yourself. And yeah, it really is about taking one step at a time. Many patients come in and, you know, and they may not know a whole lot. This may have been a completely overwhelming podcast. That's okay. You'll get there. You know, do your due diligence. Make yourself a priority. Find a practitioner who understands and who believes you as the first place that you start, and then really start educating yourself. One day I just sat down with the environmental working group and I was like, okay, I'm going to throw all these things away. I'm going to get new stuff. You just do one thing a week, buy your cast iron pan one week and then buy your air filter the next week, and you'll get there. If you do something every week, in a year, you'll be a completely different person.
Great. Excellent. Thank you so much. Where can people find you? We've got 48% of our listeners in the US. I know you, well, let me say I don't know you, but I think you do a lot of telemedicine as well, if you want to call it telemedicine. So just give us the links and just where you practice.
So I have a brick and mortar practice in Southern California in Orange County, which is between LA and San Diego, the prettiest part of prettiest part of Southern California, I would say. And the the practice is called the Spring Center. So you can find us at thespringcenter.com. You can also see me on my own website at Dr. Kelly McCann. We've got blogs, I've got a store, and I have a course that I'm working on, hoping to launch in the fall, maybe early next year. And I'm also you can find me on Instagram at Dr. Kelly McCann. I do take patients. International patients are a little bit tough with medical malpractice, but I do have licenses in 12 different states. And so people can come to the clinic as their initial appointment and then be seen via telehealth. And then I have people come once a year. But I do have a lot of resources. I have a webinar series that is available too. So there's a lot of different opportunities for those folks who can't become patients at this time. And then the courses will be for everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for your calling. And just want to declare favor and blessing over you, that you would just rise up to the very things that God has for you, that you would impact and influence people in the most incredible way. And yeah, just want to welcome you to South Africa anytime to come to Johannesburg and stay with myself and my family. Many podcast guests have come, and you can just plug into our network. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Steve. And I will take you up on that offer.